Boris Johnson campaigning on that Brexit move. How simple is it going to be to meet that December 2020 deadline?
Not simple at all if you speak to experts here, and indeed the EU's chief negotiator, former chief negotiator Michel Barnier. He says that doing this post-Brexit deal between the EU and the UK is going to be very unrealistic in that 11 months that Boris Johnson has given himself and the Conservative government. That deadline of December 2020, experts here say that Boris Johnson would have to work at breakneck speed to agree a deal by that time. Of course, the UK and the EU completely enmeshed in so many ways. The EU is the UK's biggest trading partner, and if you look at Canada and its trade deal with the European Union, it took over 7 years for them to do so, and it's nowhere near tied as closely. So a lot of experts here seemingly think that deadline is unrealistic, and that we may well see Boris Johnson requesting an extension to that deadline, so potentially breaking a manifesto pledge once we sort of draw closer to this time next year, as they don't see how this deal can be done. It of course doesn't just involve trade either. It's defence, it's security, it's fisheries, all manner of other things that need to be agreed between the EU and the UK. And while of course Boris Johnson now has a majority in his own parliament here in the House of Commons, he secured a thumping majority, 80 majority here, which is the biggest since the 1980s, since the Margaret Thatcher era. He doesn't of course the EU have to agree to anything that they agree in terms of the post-Brexit trade relationship as well. So it's not just going to be Boris Johnson and the Conservative government. Of course, there's going to be that wrangling once again, and we may well see, of course, if the UK and Boris Johnson don't hit that December 2020 deadline, that then means that the UK would leave the European Union on World Trade Organization terms. In effect, no deal.
Would that be likened to, Holly, a hard Brexit, and then bring in the issues that people were worried about, that if an agreement is not reached, there may be chaos, especially in terms of supply chain when it comes to food and medicine?
Yes, certainly. We speak to economists and businesses here. Of course, their main concern over the past few years has been that certainty. We did see a slight surge in the pound yesterday once the exit poll was released, when Boris Johnson's huge majority was confirmed. But if you speak to economists here, they say that, of course, that is probably likely due to the uncertainty that would immediately give, but that Brexit still potentially is not good for the UK. We have seen many businesses, of course, move over to Europe, many sceptical about exactly what a future trade relationship between the UK and its biggest trading partner might look like. There are, though, of course, other options for the UK now. Donald Trump already tweeting this morning, congratulating his friend Boris Johnson and saying that it now paves the way for a lucrative trade deal, more lucrative than the one that the UK currently holds with the EU. And once this transition period is out the way, whenever that may well be, the UK does of course then have license to agree its own trade relationships with other countries, potentially Africa as well. So there is a scope for, of course, Boris Johnson and his Conservative government. That is what he has been touting. But if you listened to the Labour Party, the main opposition party, during the election campaign, they were warning voters, they were warning people here that this is only the first stage of Brexit. Boris Johnson, of course, claiming that he will get Brexit done, and that he will do in one way. The withdrawal agreement will be now ratified before the deadline of January 31st, but there's another deadline next year, December 2020, and that is the next stage, and perhaps the trickier stage as well.
Holly, we know that if we're speaking about world leaders, Emmanuel Macron from France, as well as German Chancellor Angela Merkel, have said that the United Kingdom, even in December 2020, will have to follow the same kind of rules of the EU agreements, and therefore the United Kingdom can't veer too far away from the principles, essentially, of the kind of trade deal that they have been having with the EU. Has there been any response to those kind of comments?
We've heard from Boris Johnson in the last hour, but he's mainly been speaking to the British public here, thanking those voters, he says, that have switched from the main opposition party, Labour. We've seen some of the biggest swings in support in a generation, in decades. Some people that voted for Labour have voted for Labour since the 1930s, have now switched to the Conservatives, and the main reason, we think, is of course because of Brexit. Boris Johnson's Get Brexit Done message has resonated, but of course on the world stage, what does this now mean for the UK going forward? Boris Johnson has spoken to the British public earlier outside Downing Street, urging for the healing, he says, to begin, calling for unification. This vote, in many ways, while the Conservatives have had a landslide victory in England and Wales, up in Scotland, the Scottish National Party have seen a tidal wave of support, a real surge. They've actually made several gains on the Conservatives up in Scotland, and they, of course, want to remain. They want to stay in the EU, and the Scottish National Party leader Nicola Sturgeon now saying that that gives them a huge mandate for a second independence referendum, and she is laying out terms to call on Boris Johnson to do that. So in terms of the future of the UK and the Union, what does that mean? And of course, in terms of Scotland's relationship with the EU as well.
Holly Hudson, SABC correspondent, coming to us live from London. Thanks for your time this evening. And with that, we will